Thanks everybody for joining us on a Sunday. Janvi Falke was appointed founding director of Science Gallery Bangalore in 2018. Previously, she was faculty at King's College London. She started her academic career at the University of Heidelberg, following which she was based at Georgia Tech Lorraine, France, and the Imperial College London. She was a fellow of Wissenschaft College zu Berlin, the Institute of Advanced Study in Berlin. She was the external curator of to the Science Museum London and has been a scholar in residence at the Deutsche Museum Munich. She's also the author of Atomic State: Big Science in 20th Century India, and has co-edited Science of Giants, China and India in the 20th Century. She's also the producer and director of the documentary film Cyclotron. And with that, I invite Janvi to take over.
Thank you. Thanks again. And thanks, Jagat, for the introduction. So, what I'm going to share with you this evening is not for myself, a new piece of research. I worked on this a while ago, but it's a story of relevance to the exhibition that we are holding. And this is, as Jagat mentioned, our military weekend, so to speak. So, we are marking broadly what one might identify as three key layers in the history of the city, which is the military, industry and academic, or the military, industry and academia. And we have identified scholars and artists who come to speak to it. And so I thought I might as well mobilize research that I have done earlier to speak to you this evening about what is a fairly interesting project that was carried out in Bangalore. Now, what I want you to bear in mind as I share this story with you is that there are, one thing is that I'm not a military historian. So this is not military history per se, nor is it a history of the gadget per se, but rather what it takes to produce a gadget of this kind in India at the time that it was produced. So this is, starting the late 1950s up until the mid 1960s. So how, why, what, and how this was done. So that basically is the goal, because by training, I'm a historian of science and technology. And so that's my motivation for having explored this story at all. My interest began by wanting to explore the history of aerodynamics and aeronautics in India. This is an offshoot of that story. The aerodynamic story or the aeronautic story is still pending. I don't quite know if I ever will get to it. But this story in itself was very interesting anyway. And the way I put it to a friend, this would make for a really fabulous airport selling thriller novel. It's got the Nazis, it's got the Second World War, it's got a range of other people. And before I let on too much, let me start. So Vishnu Madhav Ghadge, there's an exhibit upstairs. So you must have seen the aircraft that at our doorsteps as you walked in. That was the first aircraft designed in India combined between the Indian Institute of Science and Hindustan Aeronautics Limited by V.M. Ghadge. Now, what we also have is a collection of photographs from the family of V.M. Ghadge, which is upstairs in our exhibition hall too. So please do go have a look at that too. Alongside a film that speaks to why and how HAL was, an extract from a film that speaks to how and why HAL was established. But this is where I would like to begin the story today, from Vishnu Madhav Ghadge. Now, he was a student of physics from Kolhapur in Maharashtra, and he went to the University of Göttingen to study with this man, Ludwig Prandtl, who today is identified across the world as a historians don't particularly like to use those terms, but nonetheless, they're good shorthand. He's known as the father of aerodynamics. So he in many ways instituted the study of aerodynamics as a subfield or as a sort of field of inquiry within physics. Based in Göttingen, and he had two Indian students, one of whom was Ghadge, and the other was a person from Bengal who came back and then started working, in fact, as an engineer, as a hydraulics engineer, with what we today call Central Public Works Departments. So now Prandtl is a very, very interesting figure. Do bear him in mind, because as we go along, one, of course, you'll find him upstairs. Ghadge painted a portrait of his teacher, but also his ghost will recur through the story and after as well. Now, Ghadge finished his PhD in Göttingen, came back to India, and it was wartime at the time, right? And he was appointed as the first head of the department of, a department of aeronautics was established. He was appointed the first head of the department, but he was also appointed to head Hindustan Aeronautics Limited at that point of time, which itself has a very interesting story, which we'll explore as we go along. The other person that I would like you to remember is Oskar Tietjens. Oskar Tietjens also moved from Göttingen to Bangalore, to the Indian Institute of Science in the newly established department towards the end of the war. And he was also a student of Ludwig Prandtl. Now, Oskar Tietjens, together with this person, who some of you might recognize as Otto Königsberger, very well known in the city as an architect, also the person who established the field of tropical architecture, later moved to University College London, and so Oskar Tietjens and Otto Königsberger together built what was India's first wind tunnel at the Indian Institute of Science premises. And this wind tunnel was used to test materials and models for the aircraft that we see outside. So it's an incredibly sort of, you'll probably understand the reason as to why I'm presenting a story that I had sort of looked into a long time ago, because the relevance of it today is so different, because I'm standing in Bangalore, but also we have this exhibition literally on our doorstep. So this is his Königsberger's drawing of the first wind tunnel at the Indian Institute of Science. Another image, an aerial image of the Department of Aerospace at the Indian Institute of Science. Now, the establishment of HAL. There are often stories function through urban legends, some myths, some things happen, and some of those will recur in this story, which is also what makes it quite exciting. Which is also what gives it the quality that, airport bestseller thrillers have. I'm not saying I'll ever be able to write one, but it has all the elements or the making of one. William Douglas Paulley was working in China just before and at the outbreak of the Second World War, worked very closely with Chiang Kai-shek. And in 1939-40, sometime around then, on an airplane trip to India, so there are some things that will recur in this story, like I said, the legends, so who met who when, but also lots of stories of false passports, which I will also come to in a bit. So he met Walchand Hirachand, who at that point was an industrialist interested in investing his money for the establishment of automobiles in Bangalore. In his discussions with Paulley, he also expressed his interest in wanting to invest in in aircraft manufacturing, something he wasn't able to do given that aviation, aeronautics, etc. was controlled by the British government of India. And then Paulley and he struck a deal which eventually then led to the establishment of Hindustan Aeronautics Limited, with, in fact, land and 50% of the capital coming from the state of Mysore, which is very similar to us. In fact, we have our land and 50% of our capital coming from the government of Karnataka. So, I'm loving the sort of recurrent motifs. This is Paulley when he was in China. And his Chinese journey is important to this story, not because it actually has material impact on what happened here, but because of the experience of setting up aircraft manufacturing and repair facilities that were related to the war that he came with to Bangalore. Now, here's how the circle in many ways begins to kind of both diverge but also converge in different ways. Theodor von Karman, also another Göttingen product, came from Budapest, spent considerable amount of time in Göttingen, worked with Prandtl among others, knew everybody who worked in that lab, which included Gadge and Tietjens, who we've met already. At some time during the war, he moves, not during the war, sometime after the establishment of the Third Reich, he moves to Caltech. And he's then continuing his work in aerodynamics and other stuff that he began with people in Göttingen, eventually working very closely with the Jet Propulsion Lab. So he became a very, very important figure there. Now, why do I have him here to tell you a Bangalore story? Because Paulie, at the end of war, when he left Bangalore, he left behind a scholarship at the Indian Institute of Science, at the Department of Aeronautics of the Indian Institute of Science, to say that students from the department could go to Caltech to do their PhDs. And so here you have two Göttingen people training students in India, and then Paulie leaving behind a scholarship to take students to Caltech, who then go to Caltech and then work with Theodor von Karman. So the Göttingen, Bangalore, and Pasadena connection is sort of one that one doesn't anticipate or doesn't kind of how should I put it? The strength of these connections is quite interesting and intriguing, as is the journey from aeronautics eventually to aerospace, because two of the key people who traveled on this scholarship to Caltech and became very important for India, and both were offered jobs in and around Caltech but refused to stay back there. One was Satish Dhawan and the other Rodham Narasimha. I should be speaking in the other order because Satish Dhawan was Rodham Narasimha's student. So two of the key figures in the Indian aeronautics to aerospace journey went on the Paulie scholarship to Caltech to study with people, among others, Walter Lippmann and Theodor von Karman. Now, as the students start to leave Bangalore to go study, some of them come back, some of them don't, another interesting figure emerges. Remember, what I'm trying to build, like on a board, knitted thoroughly with wool and the connections, like in a crime story. So if you see how the people and the places connect, yet another German. So Göttingen is our German connection. Oskar Tietjens is our German Bangalore connection, so on and so forth. Kurt Tank. Kurt Tank is an interesting figure for those of you who have some familiarity with military history. He was the designer, he was a key designer of the Focke-Wulf planes, which were used during the Second World War, primarily for carpet bombing, right? He was also among the people who were responsible for creating what were called at that point jet fighters. So jet fighters are a new idea during the Second World War, alongside, not necessarily alongside as in partnership, but along with Willy Messerschmitt, who designed the Messerschmitt planes, very, very important for German aviation and bombing during the Second World War. Now, at the end of the war, as some of you might already be familiar with the Project Paperclip. What Project Paperclip did was that entire labs and people were lifted from Germany and taken to the United States, some of them to the United Kingdom, and the Russians did similar things. So entire labs together with equipment were uprooted or taken away from Germany into various places. Not various places, into countries that were occupying Germany at the end of the war. Now, Kurt Tank and his team were approached by two of the victors of the Second World War, or two of the winning sides of the Second World War. He was approached by the Russians and he was approached by the British. He said yes to both. Together, and this was a bargaining conversation for his entire team. At that point, depending on who you read, it's either 45 or 62 people in his team. And after saying yes to both the Russians and the British, he allegedly, I have no proof of this, although there are people who speak of this. There are people who have afterwards archived it, but I have no documents to see it. That he took money from the Brits and then together with 45 of his people disappeared. And what we know now is that basically he and his team were basically given false passports by the Vatican, and they all went to Argentina, where they worked for the Juan Perón regime. Now, the thing that is important to note here is that Kurt Tank is an aircraft designer. In Argentina, together with a French aircraft designer and aircraft engineer, de Watine, who has also left Europe because in France, so he's French, in France he's accused of having collaborated with the occupying regime, which is the Nazi regime. And so he has also escaped to France. So de Watine and Kurt Tank get together to design what would have been Latin America's first supersonic jet fighter, which was at that point called Pulqui. So this was shared with me by a colleague from Argentina. I don't have the source for this, as was this. So where at some point they in the public domain, they started making fun of the idea because they couldn't get beyond the fourth prototype for this. Because industrial strength in Argentina at that point of time, in fact, industrial strength anywhere outside of Europe and America at that point of time was not at a point where they could actually mobilize materials and testing and especially something that we'll come to later, engines that would allow for a supersonic jet fighter to be designed, realized. But this was the first step towards Kurt Tank and his team's journey to India. And this experience would be valuable. Just like for Pauly, his experience in China was valuable to set up the kind of plants that he set up here, and that eventually congealed into HAL. For Kurt Tank and his team, having worked in Argentina was important before his journey to India. The man here is Mahavir Tyagi. Now, as the story goes, in 1956-57, again, people meet people, like Pauly met Palchand Hirachand, Mahavir Tyagi met Kurt Tank in Munich. And Kurt Tank was back in Munich together with 18 of his team, 18 members of his team, not all 45. Some of them were lost, some of them stayed back, lost their lives, older people. Mahavir Tyagi extended the invitation to Kurt Tank and his team to come to India to build a supersonic jet fighter. Tank agreed. And the reason why, of course, one more thing to remember is that by the mid-1950s, it is quote-unquote safe for former Nazi employees to return back to Germany. Things are easing up for them. But at the same time, what is also equally important to remember is that research and production areas like nuclear research, aeronautics and aerospace are not allowed to be conducted on German soil. In fact, all Germany and Japan after the Second World War, one of the reasons cited for their rapid economic development by the 1980s is that they did not have defense expenditure, which happens to be most countries' largest share of the GDP because of the occupying powers. So they're not allowed to invest in these areas, as a result of which, of course, they invest in other products and develop those. So while in the 1950s it becomes possible for people like Willy Messerschmitt or Kurt Tank to return to Germany, they cannot still conduct the work that they are used to, or that is of their professional field in quite the same way as earlier. And so the offer that Mahavir Tyagi makes on behalf of the government of India is an attractive one. And so again, to the best of my knowledge, as they say, about 13 to 18 people came to India together with Kurt Tank to HAL. Willy Messerschmitt, in the meanwhile, moved to Egypt. And bear that thought in mind because Egypt will also configure in the story. Willy Messerschmitt had been working in Spain, and Spain was the one country that allowed Germans to do both nuclear research and aerospace research, which they were not allowed to do in their own country. So which is again a very, very interesting story for those of you who are interested. There are historians of science who've written about it. Messerschmitt, so the project of building a supersonic jet fighter for his Aeronautico Hispanico, which started out in Spain, failed in the eyes of its makers and supporters and promoters, was moved to Egypt around the same time as Kurt Tank moves to India. So you have Messerschmitt near Cairo, Kurt Tank in Bangalore, both trying to build supersonic jet fighters, both conducting tests for all their materials in another so-called neutral country, Switzerland. So all the test reports of the materials are in the Swiss archives, all in German. So it is likely that while some Indian engineers and scientists would have been able to read German, of course, people like Gardke and others who have lived in Germany and also written in German, but for the most part, these reports would be inaccessible to the people they were working with. So around 1961, so 1957 to about 61, 62, you have the teams working. What is interesting to note here is that Gardke was not in favor of Kurt Tank coming to India and not coming to India as much as the supersonic jet fighter project. He would have instead liked to develop capacity at HAL and IISc in a sort of gradual and step-by-step manner. Now, these are arguments that have been held ad nauseum at different times in history for different kinds of projects. What is the best path forward? Should we leap? Should we do it, build it gradually, etc.? Gardke's argument did not win, and Kurt Tank and his team conducted the projects. Now, I'll come back to 2 or 3 things about the aircraft later, simply because I'm not the right person to be discussing the technical capacity, the technical characteristics of this aircraft, but they are important, and I'll speak to them in a little bit. But here we go, 1964, HAL to the Indian Air Force, right? So one of the reasons why we have HT2, which is Hindustan Trainer 2, on display in this exhibition is because it embodies what to historians of science and technology appears to be a rather neat, and things aren't often that neat, coming together of the military industrial academic. In the US it's called complex. We might not call it a complex here, but there are the makings of one nonetheless, because it's an aircraft that's designed by an academic institution in collaboration with a manufacturing unit for the Indian Air Force, right? So it's a very, very clean triangle in that sense. And look who came to the launch, of course. Let me see, does this, yeah. That's Homi Jahangir Bhabha, of interest to me because, in my earlier life, I've written about the beginnings of nuclear physics in India, Kurt Tank with the binoculars, and the aircraft. Hard to imagine that this would have been anywhere where today, we're in the middle of the city, actually. But lovely images. So the aircraft was used in warfare. So as you can imagine, 64, it was handed over to the Indian Air Force. 65 is the first war that the aircraft is used in. 71 is the next war that the aircraft is used in. So on and so forth. Basically, 147 exemplars are built. Again, depending on who you talk to, there were either 125 or 147 exemplars that were built. And by the 1980s, the aircraft is decommissioned. Now, a little bit about don't ask me every single detail. As I said, I'm not the person to speak to technical detail with quite the intensity that is required. But I think what's important here is that the supersonic jet fighter was a new enough idea in the 1940s and early 1950s, right? And so when Argentina tries to have it, or when India tries to have it, it's not an idea past its sell-by date in a sense. And so 2 things that are quite important to discuss, not to discuss, but to state, and with the limited capacity that I have to understand it. One is that the design of the Marut is still looked at by aircraft designers for its value, effectively. And I'll tell you, it has something called a high sweep back of the wing. All of it to what they call are characteristics for an interceptor. So it's a very well designed aircraft to reach. I mean, supersonic capacities are not easily accomplished. And the wing design, therefore, of the aircraft is something that is very, very important. And this is, again, the reason why I mentioned this is also that Both these ideas, in my discussions with Professor Raddam Narasimha, who first introduced me to this project at all, were important because they tried to rework this design again for the HF-25, but also later in order to design aircraft that would have low fuel consumption. So while for Marut, the wing design was critical for speed, they later tried to use the principle also to see if it could be extended for low fuel consumption as well. And so that's an ongoing discussion. And so and this is new at the time, right? Like, so this is something to bear in mind. More details in that, I mean, I can provide the details, but I'm not technically capable of discussing those. But the second one is more important, and that tells you that, that this entire story unfolded in the context of a word that I haven't used until now, which is the Cold War. So the design of the aircraft was based entirely, and remember, I might have said this earlier, Kurt Tank is an aircraft designer, not an engineer. Yeah. So the design was based on the fact that there would be an engine that was being designed at Bristol Siddeley, later Rolls-Royce. And so that they anticipated or expected that in that engine would be the Orpheus engine, which the British were planning to develop at that time, will be accessible to the Indians. Messerschmitt is also planning the Hell-1 based on the same assumption that those engines would be available to them. Now, unfortunately, the British scrapped the program. There are various, again, stories floating around it, and if I had continued to research that story, I would have probably looked at paperwork, whatever was accessible and non-classified in the NATO archives, because there was a how do you call it, a ring fencing and therefore export controls around what kind of engines would be supplied outside. So jet engines became a highly contentious matter in the 60s, as a result of which the British decided to not continue to work on the Orpheus engine. And the Indian government decided to not invest and underwrite the development of this new engine with money of their own. And from the numbers that are there, that are floating in the public domain, which I have not verified, but I can share that with you, is that they were about 13 million pounds of requirement at that point of time. Now, what they did instead is they then took an existing engine, which was a very, very reliable engine nonetheless. It was called the Orpheus 703. So there was nothing problematic about the engine they ended up using, but it was not designed to reach the speed that the plane could have otherwise accomplished. So in many ways, it would be fair to say that the Marut never accomplished full design capacity. So it functioned always at a suboptimal design capacity. There is another angle to the engine story, and this was brought to me by a couple of my colleagues who work in the Russian archives, David Angerman and Asif Siddiqui, that there was something called the Soviet Tumansky RD 9F engine. I have not been able to access the Soviet archives, and again, if I had continued to work on the project, I would have. But there is no evidence available to us that the Indians tried to access those engines at all. And from what I gather from my conversations with David Engerman, the door might have been opened from the Soviet side to supply those engines, but for reasons that I am not aware of right now, simply because I haven't done that research, as that we did not go for those engines. So we didn't get, so Marut basically flew at suboptimal capacity. The only reason why I have this here is that the aircraft became an object of interest beyond India, right? And especially in the Eastern Bloc, where then, I mean, this is a drawing, of course, from the Eastern Bloc. So it became a part of the modeling world, so to speak. So this is, again, from the Czech Republic. This I don't necessarily, I necessarily don't know it. So that was a redundant word. and this one is from Poland. So, not just the Marut, but the Pulukwi and the Helvan also got their models. So, how does one, in many ways, in many manners actually, pull together this story? So, there is the story of people migrating across borders, but people possessing knowledge which has become so incredibly important at that point of time that they are able to take decisions on those migrations irrespective of state borders. So people like Willie Messerschmitt and Kurt Tank are traveling to countries, well, traveling with false passports. That's the first group of people who traveled with false passports through the Vatican to Argentina. The second group of people who traveled with false passports were Americans called the Flying Tigers who went to China. And this is also during the Second World War, so the second group of people. So there's sort of that high, I mean, stories of espionage attract a certain kind of, well, the Cold War thriller stories, etc. But there's a different energy around it, but it's actually, as a historian of science and tech, it would still be interesting to us because what we have are highly skilled people with mercenary instincts. Right? And the thing is, they get enmeshed with actors who are otherwise very different to themselves, right? So Indian test pilots going to Egypt to test the Helvan and Egyptian test pilots coming to India to test the Marut because two Germans have decided to hold their place there, right? Like so where is the government of India and diplomacy, or where is the government of Egypt and diplomacy, or where is the German government entirely missing in action in this story in that sense, right? Except the first planes that both of them designed were for German government, for the use of German government during the Second World War. You have interesting Indian actors, almost all of them students, going either from here to Göttingen or then from here to Caltech. And then building upon legitimately these very troubled layers of German and Indian participation in these stories. But I mean, I say German because, Kurt Tank is important to this story, as is Otto Königsberger, as is Oskar Tietjens. But there are, of course, all the others too, right? Like there are the Egyptians, there are the Americans, and there are the Argentinians who, so the layers build upon each other, right? Like each is not possible without each other. They're not necessarily causal, but they're very, very important in feeding into each other in order to make this kind of history unfold. And how much contingency is built into this, right? Because if Kurt Tank had decided to, in a way, not go to Argentina, but go either to Russia or the UK, the story would be very, very different. So what we have here is, today we look at the Marut as an Indian project. And that is the primary reason for me to want to unpack this story in this manner, to say what goes into the making of an Indian project. It was an ambitious state-led project which involved significant resources to build India's first supersonic jet fighter. But once you start unpeeling, there's a range of things that fell into place for this project to even happen. So what does it mean to have a national project? That's one question. The other part of the question is also things travel, objects travel, but also knowledge travels. Because the people who went from Germany to Argentina, to Egypt, to India, took what they knew best with them. These weren't objects. India wasn't buying foreign objects, but this was knowledge that was traveling with these people in this manner. But equally then, someone like Ghatke going to Göttingen, studying in Göttingen, coming back here and building Hindustan Trainer 2, right? So we have objects that travel, we have people that travel, and we also have knowledge that travels. And in the convergence of all of these, different histories unfold. The Egyptian plane was not, well, the Argentinian experiment was not successful. The Egyptian one was not successful. The Indian one was, if the discussion on the internet and in the public domain is to be gone with, then it was not successful. 2 except 147 of those planes were built. 12 were sent to Ghana, and the aircraft was mobilized in at least 2 wars, if not more, if not on more occasions, definitely in 2 wars and on more occasions. So I don't quite necessarily look at this simply, if you look at the balance sheet, that it is a failed project in any way. Not to even speak about, I mean, and this is simply the laundry list of whether it succeeded or not, but the other part of it is, of course, capacity building and the ability to actually manufacture, test, and do things, right? Like, since the wind tunnels that were mobilized in Switzerland for testing materials and models for Marut, we now have similar capacity but similar facilities also in Bangalore already. Yeah, so I think in order to bring it all together, Cold War history is, of course, interesting, but I think at the end of the day, if you ask me why I would want to unpack the story of an aircraft in this manner, it is to say that objects in many ways embody the ambitions of their makers, their funders, as well as the institutional design within which they get produced. And I think this is one story that tells us how complicated the layers of intention, politics, morality all lie together. Because the mercenary instincts of Kurt Tank and his people who came and used the facilities were in fact built by the first wave of, with the help of the first wave of German migrants to India, some of whom included Jews who had escaped Nazi Germany in the 1930s. Otto Königsberger was Max Born's nephew. Oskar Tietjens had to escape because he could no longer do the kind of work that he wanted to do in Germany at the end of World War II. So, history is full of contingency. Any kind of causality and a teleological story does great disservice to the complexity of how things actually unfold. And I think we only have to look at our own lives to understand why that is the case. Thank you.